The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust as it rolled into Aspen, Colorado on a blistering August afternoon in 1876, and sitting inside with her wrists bound loosely with rope was 20-year-old Margaret Vance, sold for $50 and a promise to take care of her stepmother's mounting debts. Margaret pressed her face against the window, watching the mountains rise in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in the heat of summer, and she wondered if this was how livestock felt when being transported to market. The man sitting across from her, a trader named Silas Hoffman who specialized in procuring workers for wealthy households out west, kept his eyes on his newspaper and said nothing, which suited Margaret just fine because she had no words left anyway. Her father had died 2 winters ago, leaving her alone with a woman who had never wanted a stepdaughter in the first place. Eleanor Vance had remarried within 6 months, and the new husband had 3 sons of his own who ate through their supplies like locusts. Margaret had tried to make herself useful, taking in sewing and laundry work, but it was never enough. 3 days ago, Eleanor had told her to pack a bag. A man was coming who could find her work out west, good work that paid well, and Margaret would finally stop being a burden on the family. Margaret had believed her right up, until Hoffman had counted out the coins into Eleanor's palm and tied the rope around her wrists, not tight enough to hurt but visible enough to make his ownership clear. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a rough wooden building with a sign that read Trading Post and General Store. Hoffman folded his newspaper and finally looked at Margaret with eyes that held neither cruelty nor kindness, just business. "You will fetch a good price here," he said matter-of-factly. "Mining town, plenty of men looking for wives or housekeepers. You are young, healthy, can read and write from what your stepmother said. Someone will take you before sundown." Margaret's throat tightened, but she refused to cry. She had done enough crying in the darkness of the stagecoach at night when Hoffman was asleep. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. "And if no one wants me?" "Then we move on to the next town," Hoffman said, climbing out of the coach and gesturing for her to follow. "But that has never happened yet. There is always someone." The trading post was crowded with men, and the smell of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies hit Margaret as soon as she stepped inside. Hoffman led her to the back of the room where a makeshift platform had been set up, and Margaret realized with growing horror that she was not the only one being sold today. 2 other women stood there, both older than her, both wearing the same expression of resigned desperation. One had a black eye, and the other kept her hand protectively over her stomach in a way that suggested she was carrying a child. The auction, though Hoffman insisted on calling it a work placement service, began within the hour. Margaret stood with her shoulders back, trying to maintain some dignity as men looked her over like they would a horse. The pregnant woman went first, sold to a rancher who needed help with his ailing wife. The woman with the black eye went to a saloon owner, and Margaret's stomach turned at the implications. Then it was her turn. Hoffman listed her qualities like she was livestock. Margaret Vance, 20 years old, can read and write, experience with sewing and household management. Healthy, strong, no known illnesses. Starting bid is $60. The room was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret felt a strange mix of humiliation and relief. Maybe no one would want her. Maybe she could somehow escape and find work on her own terms. Then a voice from the back called out, $60. Margaret's eyes searched the crowd and landed on a tall man with dark hair and sun-bronzed skin, wearing dusty trail clothes and a black hat pushed back on his head. He was younger than most of the men in the room, perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features and eyes that were watching her with something that looked almost like sympathy. 70, another voice called, this one belonging to a heavyset man with a thick beard and clothes that reeked of whiskey even from across the room. The tall man in the back straightened. 80. 90, the drunk man countered, leaning forward with interest that made Margaret's skin crawl. $100, the tall man said firmly, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. Cash. Hoffman's eyebrows rose. $100 was more than twice what he had paid for Margaret. The drunk man cursed and waved his hand dismissively, stumbling back toward the bar. No one else bid. Sold to Tobias Xander, Hoffman announced, gesturing for the tall man to come forward. Tobias moved through the crowd with an easy confidence, pulling a leather pouch from his coat and counting out the coins onto Hoffman's palm with steady hands. Up close, Margaret could see that his eyes were a striking blue-gray, like a winter sky, and there were lines at the corners that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He looked at her, really looked at her, meeting her eyes instead of examining her like an object, and something in Margaret's chest loosened slightly. "The rope," Tobias said to Hoffman, his voice low and even. "Take it off." Hoffman complied, untying the rope from Margaret's wrists and pocketing it. "She is yours now. No refunds." "I understand," Tobias said, though his jaw tightened. He turned to Margaret and spoke gently. "I have supplies to gather, then we will head to my ranch. It is about an hour's ride from town." "Can you ride?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Her wrists ached where the rope had been, even though it had not been tied tightly. Tobias studied her for another moment, then gestured toward the door. "Let us get you out of here." The fresh air outside was a blessing after the stuffiness of the trading post. Margaret took deep breaths, trying to steady herself as Tobias untied 2 horses from the hitching post, a large bay gelding and a smaller chestnut mare. He handed Margaret a canteen and she drank gratefully, the water cool and clean. "Thank you," she managed to say, her first words to him. "You are welcome," Tobias replied, securing his supplies to the bay's saddle. "I need to make a few more stops." "Will you be all right waiting here with the horses?" Margaret nodded, and Tobias disappeared into the general store across the street. She stood in the shade of the building, stroking the mare's soft nose and trying to process what had just happened. She had been bought by a stranger, a cowboy named Tobias Xander, who had paid $100 for her, and then looked at her like she was a person instead of property. She did not know whether to feel relieved or terrified. When Tobias returned, his arms were full of packages that he efficiently tied to his saddle. He mounted the bay and then looked down at Margaret. "The mare is gentle. Her name is Clementine. She will take care of you." Margaret had ridden before, though not in several years. She gathered her skirts and managed to pull herself into the saddle with only minor difficulty. Tobias waited patiently, then turned his horse toward the mountains and urged it into an easy walk. Margaret followed, and they left Aspen behind. They rode in silence for the first 20 minutes, climbing gradually into the foothills where pine trees began to replace the scrub brush of the lower elevations. The air grew cooler and sweeter, and despite everything, Margaret felt something like peace settling over her. Finally, Tobias spoke. "I want you to understand something," he said, not looking back at her. "I did not buy you to own you. What happened back there was wrong, but I could not leave you to be taken by someone who would hurt you." Margaret's throat tightened. "Then why did you buy me at all?" Tobias was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "I lost my wife and daughter 3 years ago. Fever took them both in the span of a week. I have been running my ranch alone since then, and it has been hard. I need help, that is true. But I need someone who wants to be there, not someone who is there against their will." "So what happens now?" Margaret asked, her hands tightening on the reins. "Now you have a choice," Tobias said, finally turning to look at her. "You can work on my ranch as a housekeeper and cook. I will pay you a fair wage and you will have your own room. When you have saved enough money, if you want to leave, you can. Or if you want to stay, you can do that too. But it is your choice." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for deception and finding none. "Why would you do that?" "You paid $100 for me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Tobias said simply. "And because my mother raised me to treat women with respect, not like they are property to be bought and sold." Tears burned in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. "What if I am not a good housekeeper? What if I cannot do the work?" A small smile touched Tobias's lips, the first she had seen from him. "Then we will figure it out together. I am not the easiest person to work for, I will admit. I get focused on the ranch and forget to eat sometimes. I track mud through the house. I leave my tools where they do not belong, but I am fair, and I keep my word." They rode on, and Margaret felt the weight on her chest beginning to lift. She was not sure if she could trust Tobias Xander yet, but she wanted to. She wanted to believe that there was still kindness in the world, that not all men were like her stepmother's new husband or the drunk man at the auction. The ranch, when it came into view, was more substantial than Margaret had expected. A 2-story log house with a covered porch sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a barn and several outbuildings visible behind it. Cattle grazed in a fenced pasture, and she could hear the sound of water running somewhere nearby, probably a creek. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, and Margaret felt something in her chest unknot slightly. Tobias dismounted and helped Margaret down from the mare, his hands respectful and brief on her waist. "Welcome to the Xander Ranch," he said. "Let me show you around." The house was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's home, though there was definitely a layer of dust on the furniture and dishes stacked in the kitchen that needed washing. Tobias led her upstairs and showed her a small bedroom with a window that looked out over the mountains. There was a bed with a quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. It was simple but clean. "This was going to be my daughter's room when she got older," Tobias said quietly. "It has been empty since they died, but I think she would be happy to know someone was using it." Margaret set down her small bag and turned to face him. "What were their names?" "Your wife and daughter." "Anna and Rose," Tobias said, and the pain in his eyes was still fresh even after 3 years. "Anna was 23. Rose was just 2 years old." "I am sorry," Margaret said softly, and she meant it. She knew what it was like to lose people you loved. Tobias nodded, then cleared his throat. "I will let you settle in. There is water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. When you are ready, come downstairs and I will show you the kitchen and the rest of the house." "No rush." He left, closing the door behind him, and Margaret sat down on the bed, her hands trembling. She had spent the past 3 days in a state of fear and uncertainty, not knowing what her fate would be, and now she was in a stranger's house in the mountains of Colorado, being treated like a guest instead of property. It was overwhelming. She washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher, then changed out of her dusty traveling dress into the only other dress she owned, a faded blue calico that had been mended too many times. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a young woman with dark hair, gray eyes, and a face that was too thin from worry and insufficient meals. But there was still determination in that face, and Margaret clung to that. Downstairs, she found Tobias in the kitchen, attempting to start a fire in the stove and not succeeding very well. He looked up when she entered and had the grace to look sheepish. "I am better with cattle than cooking fires," he admitted. Margaret could not help it. She laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It felt good to laugh after days of fear. "Let me," she said, moving to the stove. Within minutes, she had the fire going properly and was examining the supplies in the pantry. There was flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and a few other staples. Enough to make a decent meal. "When did you last eat something that was not burned or half raw?" Margaret asked, pulling out ingredients. Tobias thought about it. "Maybe a week ago. I went into town and had a meal at the hotel." Margaret shook her head, but she was smiling slightly. "Sit down. I will make us some supper." She fell into the familiar rhythm of cooking, and it soothed her nerves. She made biscuits and gravy with the salt pork, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Tobias sat at the table and watched her work, and there was something peaceful about it, something almost normal. When she set the plates on the table, Tobias looked at the food like it was a feast. He waited until she sat down before he started eating, and his eyes closed in appreciation at the first bite. "This is the best thing I have tasted in months," he said honestly. "It is just biscuits and gravy," Margaret said, but she felt pleased nonetheless. "It is a real meal made by someone who knows what they are doing," Tobias corrected. "You have no idea how valuable that is to me." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Tobias started talking. He told her about the ranch, how he had started it 5 years ago with money he had saved from working cattle drives. He told her about the cattle, the challenges of ranching in the mountains, the neighbors who were scattered few and far between. He told her about the winters, which were harsh but beautiful, and the summers, which were short but glorious. He talked easily, and Margaret found herself relaxing, asking questions, joining the conversation. "What about you?" Tobias asked finally. "How did you end up in that trading post?" Margaret's face tightened, but she forced herself to tell the story. She told him about her father's death, her stepmother's resentment, the new husband and his sons who had no use for her. She told him about being sold like an unwanted piece of furniture, about the 3-day journey in the stagecoach, about the fear that had consumed her when she realized what was happening. Her voice remained steady through most of it, but it cracked at the end, and she had to stop and take a breath. Tobias listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his jaw was tight with anger. "What your stepmother did was cruel and illegal. You could report her to the authorities." "And say what?" Margaret asked bitterly. "She would claim I left of my own free will. Hoffman would disappear, and I would be left with nothing but accusations and no proof. Women like me do not get justice, Mr. Xander. We just survive." "Tobias," he said firmly. "Call me Tobias. And you are right, the law often fails women, but that does not make what happened to you acceptable. You deserve better." Margaret looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me as a person, for giving me a choice. That means more than you know." Tobias reached across the table and briefly squeezed her hand, then pulled back. "You are safe here, Margaret. I give you my word on that." That night, Margaret lay in the small bedroom and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. She could hear the wind in the pines, the distant lowing of cattle, and the creak of the house. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. She did not know what the future held, but at least for now, she was safe. The next morning, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. She dressed quickly and found Tobias in the kitchen, looking pleased with himself. "I managed not to burn the coffee," he announced. Margaret laughed and took over, making a proper breakfast of flapjacks and bacon. As they ate, Tobias laid out the daily routine of the ranch. He needed to check on the cattle, mend some fencing, and work with a young colt he was training. Margaret would have the house to herself for most of the day, and she could start with whatever she felt needed doing most. "There is no rush," Tobias said. This is your first full day here. Take your time getting settled. But Margaret had never been good at sitting idle. After Tobias left for the barn, she rolled up her sleeves and started cleaning in earnest. She swept and dusted, washed dishes and windows, scrubbed floors and beat the rugs outside until they stopped releasing clouds of dust. She found satisfaction in the work, in making order out of chaos. By the time Tobias came back for lunch, the house looked and smelled completely different. He stood in the doorway and stared. "I forgot what this place could look like," he said, sounding amazed. "It is a good house," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It just needed some attention." Over the next week, they fell into a comfortable routine. Tobias worked the ranch and Margaret kept the house and cooked the meals. They talked during breakfast and supper, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Margaret learned that Tobias had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, and had headed west looking for adventure and opportunity. He had met Anna in Denver, married her within 3 months, and brought her to the ranch he had just purchased. They had been happy, planning a big family, and then the fever had come and taken everything. Margaret told him about her childhood, about her father who had been a school teacher and had made sure she could read and write and do figures. She told him about her mother, who had died when Margaret was 12, and how everything had changed after her father remarried. She spoke of small dreams she had once had of teaching school herself, of having a home and family of her own, dreams that had seemed to die with her father. "Why could you not still teach?" Tobias asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "I have no credentials, no connections," Margaret said. "And I am a woman alone with a questionable past now. Who would trust me with their children?" "I would," Tobias said simply. "When I look at you, I see someone intelligent and strong and capable. Anyone who cannot see that is a fool." Margaret felt her cheeks warm and was grateful for the gathering darkness that hid her blush. She was starting to feel things for Tobias that went beyond gratitude, and she was not sure what to do about them. He was kind and respectful, but he was also still grieving his wife. Margaret did not want to presume anything or make a fool of herself. But she could not deny the way her heart lifted when she heard his footsteps on the porch, or the way she found herself taking extra care with his meals, or the way she liked to watch him work with the horses, his movements patient and sure. She was falling for him, and it terrified her because she did not know if he could ever feel the same way about her. August turned into September, and the aspen trees on the mountainsides began to change color, blazing gold against the dark green of the pines. Margaret had been on the ranch for a month, and it had started to feel like home. She had her own routine, her own space, and she was earning her first real wages. Tobias paid her $10 at the end of the month, and she tucked the coins away in a small box under her bed, her emergency fund in case things went wrong. But things were not going wrong. If anything, they were going wonderfully right. Margaret caught herself humming while she worked, something she had not done in years. She laughed more easily, slept more soundly, and felt like a person again instead of a burden. One afternoon in late September, a neighbor named Samuel Wright stopped by with his wife, Beatrice. They were a couple in their 50s who owned the ranch to the south, and they had come to welcome the new housekeeper. Beatrice was warm and friendly, immediately putting Margaret at ease, and Samuel shook Tobias's hand with genuine affection. "About time you got yourself some help," Samuel said, clapping Tobias on the shoulder. "You have been working yourself into the ground." "Margaret has been a blessing," Tobias said, and the way he said it made Margaret's heart skip. He was looking at her with something that looked almost like pride, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. Beatrice invited them both to a harvest dance the following weekend at the community hall in town, and Tobias accepted before Margaret could think of an excuse. After the Wrights left, Margaret turned to him with wide eyes. "I have not danced in years. I do not know if I remember how." "Then we will be a pair of fools together," Tobias said, grinning. "Besides, it will be good for both of us to get out and socialize. We spend too much time up here alone." The week leading up to the dance, Margaret found herself feeling nervous and excited in equal measure. She had only the 2 dresses she owned, and neither was suitable for a social occasion. When she mentioned this to Tobias, he rode into town the next day and returned with fabric, thread, and ribbons. "I have no idea what you need for a dress," he admitted, handing her the packages. "But Mrs. Henderson at the general store said these were what women were buying lately." Margaret stared at the beautiful blue calico and the delicate lace trim, her throat tight. "Tobias, this is too much. This must have cost a fortune." "It is your wages," he said firmly. "Spend them how you like. Besides, you deserve something pretty." Margaret spent every spare moment that week sewing, her fingers remembering the skills her mother had taught her years ago. She made a simple but elegant dress with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, adding the lace at the collar and cuffs. When she tried it on the night before the dance, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like a young woman going to a social event, not a girl who had been sold by her stepmother. The harvest dance was being held at the community hall, a large wooden building in town that was used for everything from church services to town meetings. When Margaret and Tobias arrived, the place was already crowded with people, and musicians were tuning their instruments on a small stage at one end. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over everything, and tables along the walls were laden with food. Margaret felt suddenly shy, standing at the edge of the crowd in her new dress, but Tobias offered her his arm. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "I will introduce you to people." And he did, proudly presenting her as his housekeeper and friend. People were friendly and welcoming, and Margaret found herself relaxing and even enjoying the conversations. When the music started, Tobias led her onto the dance floor, and they stumbled through a reel together, laughing at their mistakes. Neither of them was a particularly good dancer, but it did not matter. What mattered was the warmth of his hand in hers, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, and the way her heart felt light for the first time in years. During a break in the dancing, Beatrice Wright pulled Margaret aside. "That man is in love with you," she said matter-of-factly. "He just does not know it yet." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "We are just friends. He still grieves his wife." "Of course he does, and he always will in some way," Beatrice said. "But that does not mean he cannot love again. I see the way he looks at you, dear. That is not how a man looks at his housekeeper." Margaret did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But Beatrice's words stayed with her through the rest of the evening, giving her a small seed of hope that she was afraid to nurture. On the ride home, with the stars bright overhead and the air crisp with the promise of autumn, Tobias was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking about something." "What?" Margaret asked, her heart beating faster. "You have been on the ranch for 6 weeks now," Tobias said, "and I realize I have been thinking of you less as my housekeeper and more as my partner. You are not just someone who works for me. You are someone I share my days with, someone I look forward to talking to, someone who has made my house feel like a home again." Margaret held her breath, not daring to hope too much. "What I am trying to say, very badly, is that I have come to care for you a great deal," Tobias continued, his voice rough with emotion. "And I do not want you to feel obligated to me because of how we met or because I paid for your freedom. But if you might feel the same way, even a little, I would like the chance to court you properly, to see if what I am feeling could grow into something more." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "I do feel the same way," she said, her voice trembling. "I have been falling for you almost since the first day, and it scared me because I did not think you could ever see me as anything more than someone you rescued." Tobias pulled his horse to a stop and turned to look at her, his eyes shining in the starlight. "I did not rescue you, Margaret. You were already strong and brave and capable when I met you. All I did was give you a chance to show it, and you have become a blessing to me, the greatest blessing I could have asked for. You brought light back into my life when I thought it would always be dark." They dismounted, and Tobias took her hands in his touch gentle and reverent. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. "Yes," Margaret whispered, and when his lips met hers it was like coming home. The kiss was tender and sweet, full of promise and new beginnings, and when they pulled apart both of them were smiling. They courted through the fall, taking long walks through the golden aspen groves, riding together to check the cattle, and spending evenings on the porch talking about everything and nothing. Tobias was attentive and romantic, bringing her wildflowers and carving her a beautiful wooden box for her treasures. Margaret cooked his favorite meals and mended his clothes with careful stitches, and they learned each other's habits and quirks and fell more deeply in love with each passing day. In late October, the first snow came, dusting the mountains white and making the world look clean and new. Tobias proposed that evening, kneeling in front of the fireplace while Margaret sat in the rocking chair with a cup of tea. He did not have a ring yet, but he had his heart in his hands and love in his eyes. "I know we have not been courting long," he said, "but I am certain of my feelings. I love you, Margaret Vance. You have brought joy and purpose back into my life. You have made me believe in happiness again. Will you marry me?" Margaret set down her tea with shaking hands and dropped to her knees in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Tobias Xander. I love you so much." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and they held each other in front of the fire while the snow fell outside and the future stretched before them bright with promise. They were married in November in the little church in Aspen, with Samuel and Beatrice right standing as witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress that Beatrice had helped her make, a beautiful ivory silk with lace at the collar, and Tobias wore his best suit. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, with neighbors and friends gathering to celebrate. Margaret was overwhelmed by the kindness shown to her, the acceptance of this community that had taken her in as one of their own. She was no longer the girl who had been sold by her stepmother. She was Margaret Xander now, wife of Tobias Xander, and she had a home and a future. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, both of them nervous and eager in equal measure. Tobias was gentle with her, taking his time, and when they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that made Margaret's heart overflow. Afterward, they lay tangled in the quilts and blankets, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams. "I want children," Tobias said, his hand resting on her stomach. "If we are blessed with them, I want to fill this house with laughter and noise again." "So do I," Margaret said, snuggling closer to him. "I want a family with you. I want to build a life here and grow old together." "Then that is what we will do," Tobias promised, kissing her forehead. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you know you are loved and valued and treasured." The winter was long and harsh, but Margaret had never been happier. She and Tobias worked together to keep the ranch running, feeding cattle in the snow, keeping the house warm and spending long evenings in front of the fire. They played cards and read books aloud, and made love with increasing confidence and joy. When the passes snowed in and they were isolated for weeks at a time, it felt like they were the only two people in the world, and that was just fine with both of them. In March, Margaret realized she had missed her monthly courses twice, and her breasts were tender. She said nothing at first, not wanting to disappoint Tobias if she was wrong, but by April it was undeniable. She was carrying their child. She told him on a warm spring evening when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom on the mountainsides. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and Margaret took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "There is someone new in our family," she said softly. "We are going to have a baby." Tobias's eyes went wide, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then he let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to be parents. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Tobias said, cradling her face in his hands. "You have given me everything, Margaret. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. You are my blessing, my greatest blessing." The pregnancy was not always easy, but Tobias was attentive and caring, taking over more of the household chores and insisting that Margaret rest. Beatrice Wright came by regularly to check on her and bring supplies, and the community rallied around them with gifts and advice. Margaret felt truly loved and supported in a way she had never experienced before. In December, with snow deep on the ground and the house warm and cozy, Margaret went into labor. Beatrice served as midwife, and Tobias held Margaret's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning, but finally, their son was born, red-faced and howling with healthy lungs. Tobias cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny miracle in his arms. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Tobias thought for a moment, then looked at her with soft eyes. "How about Michael, after my father, Michael Xander?" "Michael," Margaret repeated, testing the name. "I love it." Little Michael was a good baby, content to nurse and sleep and gaze at the world with solemn blue eyes. Tobias was a devoted father, taking over many of the household chores so Margaret could focus on the baby, and spending hours just watching his son sleep with an expression of pure wonder. Margaret fell in love with Tobias all over again, seeing him be so tender and protective with their child. The first year of Michael's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and joyful days. He grew strong and healthy, learning to smile and laugh and eventually crawl. The ranch prospered, with good calves that spring and summer, and they were able to hire a young ranch hand named Peter to help with the heavy work. This gave Tobias more time to spend with his family, and he treasured every moment. When Michael was 18 months old, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born in the spring of 1879, a beautiful girl with dark hair and gray eyes like her mother. They named her Clara, after Tobias's mother, and she was as different from her brother as could be, fussy and demanding and full of personality from day one. Tobias loved both children fiercely, and the house was indeed filled with laughter and noise just as he had hoped. Margaret sometimes had to pinch herself to believe this was her life now, so different from the terrified girl who had been sold in a trading post 3 years ago. She had a husband who adored her, 2 healthy children, a home she loved, and a community that valued her. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. One evening in the summer of 1880, After the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret and Tobias sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars come out. Tobias pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Do you remember the first night you were here?" he asked. "When you made me that supper of biscuits and gravy?" "Of course," Margaret said, smiling at the memory. "You looked at it like it was a feast." "It was," Tobias said, "because it was the first time in 3 years that I felt like I had a home instead of just a house." "You did that, Margaret. You took a broken man living alone in the mountains and gave him a reason to live again. You gave me love and family and happiness. You are my blessing, and I thank God for you every single day." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes shining with tears. "And you saved me, not just from that auction, but from a life without hope or purpose. You saw me as a person when everyone else saw me as a burden. You gave me choices and freedom and love. You made me believe in happiness again." "We saved each other," Tobias said, kissing her softly. "And we built this life together. Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," Margaret agreed, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the peaceful sounds of their ranch. The years that followed were good ones. Michael and Clara grew into bright, happy children, and Margaret gave birth to 2 more sons, James in 1881 and Thomas in 1883. The house was always full of noise and activity, with children running through the rooms and toys scattered on the floors. The ranch continued to prosper, and they were able to expand, buying more land and cattle. Tobias hired more help, allowing him to spend more time with his growing family. Margaret became involved in the community, helping to establish a small school in Aspen, and even teaching there occasionally when the regular teacher was ill. She also organized a women's charitable society that helped families in need, remembering all too well what it was like to be desperate and alone. She was respected and valued, and she used her position to help others who had fallen on hard times. Tobias became a leader in the ranching community, known for his fair dealing and innovative methods. He served on the town council and was instrumental in bringing improvements to Aspen, including a better road to the railroad and a telegraph line. But his greatest joy was always his family, and he made sure they knew it every day. When Margaret turned 30 in 1886, Tobias threw her a party at the ranch, inviting all their friends and neighbors. The children helped decorate the house with wildflowers and handmade banners, and Beatrice Wright made an enormous cake. As Margaret stood surrounded by people who loved her, watching her husband dance with their daughter while their sons played with the other children, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Tobias gave her a gift. It was a beautiful necklace with a pendant in the shape of a heart, and inside was engraved "My blessing." "I had it made specially," Tobias said, fastening it around her neck, "because that is what you are and always will be, my greatest blessing." Margaret touched the pendant, her throat tight with emotion. "I love you so much," she whispered. "And I love you," Tobias said, pulling her into his arms, "more than I could ever put into words." The seasons continued to turn, and their life together continued to be full of love and purpose. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, childhood illnesses and growing pains. But they faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. Michael grew into a serious, responsible young man who loved the ranch and wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. Clara was smart and independent, with dreams of becoming a teacher like her mother. James was the adventurous one, always getting into mischief, and Thomas was quiet and gentle, preferring books to outdoor work. Tobias and Margaret loved each of their children for who they were, encouraging their dreams and supporting their choices. One day in the spring of 1890, Margaret received a letter forwarded from town. She did not recognize the handwriting, and when she opened it, her hands began to shake. It was from her stepmother's lawyer, informing her that Eleanor had died and left a small inheritance to Margaret, along with a letter of apology. Margaret sat down heavily, not sure what to feel. She read Eleanor's letter, which was full of regret and excuses, explaining that she had been desperate and frightened and had made a terrible mistake. She begged Margaret's forgiveness and said she had thought about her stepdaughter every day since selling her. Tobias found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face. He read the letters and then pulled her into his arms. "What do you want to do?" he asked gently. "I want to forgive her," Margaret said. "Not because she deserves it, but because I do not want to carry that anger anymore. She made a terrible choice that could have destroyed my life. But instead, it led me to you and to this life we have built together. I cannot regret that." "You are a better person than most," Tobias said, kissing her forehead. "What about the inheritance?" Margaret thought about it, then made a decision. "I want to use it to help other women who find themselves in desperate situations. Maybe establish a home in town where women can stay temporarily while they get on their feet, so that no one else has to go through what I did." And that is exactly what she did. The Margaret Xander Home for Women opened in Aspen in 1891, providing safe housing and job training for women in need. Margaret ran it with the help of other community women, and it became a vital resource for the area. She poured her heart into the work, remembering all too well what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness and purpose. The children grew and eventually began lives of their own. Michael married a neighboring rancher's daughter and took over more responsibility for the ranch. Clara went to Denver to attend normal school and became a teacher. James joined the cavalry and sent letters from all over the West. Thomas went to college and became a lawyer. Through it all, Tobias and Margaret remained each other's constant, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, delighting in the children that Michael and his wife brought into the world. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, weathered losses and celebrated triumphs, and never took for granted the life they had built together. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1897, Tobias took Margaret on a trip to Denver, just the two of them. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in fine restaurants, and went to the theater. It was a wonderful adventure, but both of them were happy to return to their ranch in the mountains. On their last night in the hotel, Tobias pulled Margaret onto the balcony to look at the stars. 20 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I saw you standing on that platform, trying so hard to be brave, and sometimes it feels like you have been part of my life forever. I was so scared that day, Margaret admitted. I had no idea what was going to happen to me, and then you bit on me, and I did not know if I should be terrified or relieved. I saw you, Tobias said, turning to face her. Really saw you. I saw a young woman who had been dealt a terrible hand but who still had strength and dignity. I saw someone who deserved so much better than what life had given her, and I wanted to help if I could. You did more than help, Margaret said, touching his face gently. You gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You gave me a home and family and purpose. You made me believe in myself again. You did the same for me, Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions but not really living. You brought me back to life, Margaret. You are my heart, my home, my everything. They kissed under the stars, and Margaret felt the same rush of love and desire she had felt on their wedding night 20 years ago. Some things never changed, and her love for this man was one of them. The new century arrived, and with it came changes. The Wild West was becoming tamer, with more law and order, better roads and communications. But the Xander Ranch remained much as it had always been, a working cattle ranch in the mountains where family and hard work were valued above all else. In 1905, Margaret turned 50 and Tobias turned 54. They were both still healthy and active, though their hair was now streaked with gray, and their faces bore the lines of a life well lived. They had 9 grandchildren by then, with more on the way, and the house was often full of visiting family. One summer evening, with the whole family gathered for a barbecue, Margaret stood on the porch and surveyed the scene before her. Michael was teaching his oldest son to rope a post, while Clara's children played in the yard. James was home on leave, telling stories that made everyone laugh, and Thomas was deep in conversation with Tobias about politics. Wives and husbands mixed and mingled, and the air was filled with laughter and the smell of good food. Beatrice Wright, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, came to stand beside Margaret. "You have built something beautiful here," she said. "Tobias and I built it together," Margaret corrected. "I could not have done any of this without him." "That is what love does," Beatrice said wisely. "It makes us stronger and better than we could ever be alone. You two are proof of that." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Margaret and Tobias took their familiar places on the porch, watching the stars as they had done countless times over the years. Tobias pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day in the trading post?" Tobias asked. "About how different things could have been?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "If someone else had bought me, or if I had somehow escaped and run away, or if you had not been there at all. But then I realized that wondering about what might have been is pointless. This is what is, and it is more than I ever dreamed possible. I used to think losing Anna and Rose was the end of my happiness," Tobias said quietly, "and for a long time it was. But then you came into my life, and I learned that the heart has an infinite capacity for love. I will always grieve for them, but that does not diminish what I feel for you. You are not a replacement or a consolation prize. You are your own blessing, your own gift, and I love you completely." Margaret turned to kiss him, her heart full to bursting. "And I love you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Tobias Xander. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Tobias said again, the phrase that had become their truth over the years. "And we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life filled with love and purpose. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, and a cool breeze brought the scent of pine and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the cattle lowed softly in their pastures. It was the sound of home, of safety, of everything they had worked so hard to build. The years continued to roll by, bringing more joys and sorrows, more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, more changes to the world around them. But through it all, Tobias and Margaret remained steadfast in their love for each other and their family. The ranch passed to Michael, as they had always planned, but Tobias and Margaret remained active and involved, still contributing to the community and helping where they could. In 1912, Tobias turned 66, and his health began to decline. It was nothing dramatic, just the natural slowing down that comes with age. He could no longer work the long hours he once had, and he tired more easily. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Margaret never wavered. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching yet another glorious sunset, Tobias took Margaret's hand. "I want you to promise me something," he said. "What?" Margaret asked, her heart clenching because she knew what was coming. They were both getting older, and the time they had left together was growing shorter. "When I am gone, I want you to keep living," Tobias said. "Really living, not just existing. Stay involved with the community, spend time with the children and grandchildren, keep running the women's home. Do not let grief consume you the way it consumed me after Anna and Rose died. Promise me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I promise. But you have to promise me the same thing if I go first." "I promise," Tobias said, though they both knew that Margaret, being younger and healthier, would likely outlive him. They sat in silence for a while, both of them thinking about mortality and legacy and all the moments they had shared. Finally, Margaret spoke. "We have had a good life together, have we not?" "The best life," Tobias agreed. "Better than I ever could have imagined. You gave me 37 years of happiness, Margaret. You gave me children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You gave me purpose and joy and love. I have no regrets." "Neither do I," Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Even the hard parts brought us here to this moment. I would not change anything." They watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. When the stars began to appear, Tobias stood and helped Margaret to her feet. "Come to bed," he said gently. "We have tomorrow to look forward to." And they did have tomorrow and many more tomorrows after that. Tobias lived until 1915, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 69 with Margaret at his side. His funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado, all the people whose lives he had touched with his kindness and integrity. Margaret stood surrounded by her children and grandchildren, grieving deeply but also grateful for the life they had shared. She kept her promise to him, staying active and involved in the community, spending time with family, and continuing to run the women's home. She found comfort in the routines they had established together, and in the love of her large family. She remained in the ranch house, though Michael and his family were the primary residents now, and she spent her days writing letters, reading, doing needlework, and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about their grandfather and the life they had built together. On the 20th anniversary of Tobias's death, in 1935, Margaret was 80 years old and still relatively healthy. She sat on the porch of the ranch house, in the same spot where she and Tobias had spent so many evenings, and looked out at the mountains she had come to love so dearly. The world had changed dramatically since that day in 1876, when she had been sold in a trading post in this very town. Women could vote now, could own property, could control their own destinies in ways that had been unimaginable back then. The women's home she had established was still operating, now run by her granddaughter, and had helped hundreds of women over the years. The Xander ranch was thriving under Michael's management, and all of her children and most of her grandchildren lived within visiting distance. She had lived to see 15 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. She had lived a full life, had loved and been loved, had made a difference in the world. She thought about Tobias and how he had called her his blessing, but the truth was they had been blessings to each other. Two broken people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and had built something beautiful together. "I miss you," she whispered to the mountains and the stars and the spirit of the man she had loved for so many years. "But I am grateful for every moment we had. You kept your promise and I kept mine. We saved each other, just like you always said." The wind rustled through the aspen trees, and Margaret could almost hear Tobias's voice in the sound, telling her he loved her, telling her she was his blessing. She smiled, her face lined with age but still beautiful in the fading light, and felt content. Whatever time she had left, she would spend it treasuring the memories they had made and the legacy they had built together. Margaret lived another 5 years, passing away peacefully in her sleep in 1940 at the age of 85. She was buried next to Tobias on a hillside overlooking the ranch, and her funeral was attended by 5 generations of family and friends. The story of how Tobias had saved her from being sold and how she had saved him from grief became a family legend, passed down through the generations as an example of love, courage, and the power of second chances. The Xander Ranch continued to operate for many more decades, and the women's home Margaret had established remained open until the 1970s, when changing social services made it less necessary. But the impact of Margaret and Tobias's love and generosity rippled outward through time, touching countless lives and proving that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and love can prevail. Their story began with a young woman being sold like property in a trading post, a cowboy who could not stand by and watch injustice happen, and a choice to see each other as fully human and worthy of love. It ended with a legacy of family, community service, and enduring love that lasted far beyond their lifetimes. They had indeed saved each other, and in doing so, they had saved countless others as well. That was their true blessing, the gift they gave to the world and to each other, a love story that proved even the worst circumstances could lead to the most beautiful outcomes when courage and compassion prevailed.